So once you've watched the videos and have a grasp of what feminist theory is, in which it is a perspective in which we examine inequality based on gender within society, based on laws and systemic practices from the past that continue to create inequality today, that what we're doing is we're looking within inside a story in order to understand inequality for female characters and how it's presented in the story. The key part to remember in literary analysis is that in addition to looking up literary devices, finding meaning behind the symbols and representations within the lead, within the narration, the character, within all of the elements that you have analyzed within the story, we're going to add in one more part. So after looking at all the literary devices, after I read this story the first time, the meaning for me, the theme, would be about resilience, about finding it within yourself to push up, push on, and create the life that you want. So what does it mean to examine it from a feminist perspective? It means that we're shifting that the theme can stay the same, but we're going to examine it within the concepts of feminism in order to see what further meaning we can identify. So we can identify that the female protagonist is nameless in this particular story, and there is a question as to whether or not there is a purpose to that. Is it because of how it's presented in first, second, or third person narration, or is it because that she is not in a position of power and therefore isn't named? In addition to examining that character, we are looking at her feeling that she is always trying to succeed but really can't until that very end moment. So the idea of, building up resiliency and then eventually creating a life of your own. So how does that change when we analyze it from these concepts? So remember that the first reading is through looking for literary devices, and with this we're just adding into those layers to figure out if we can determine if, when examining it from a feminist perspective, that we have more of an analysis or more substance to what it is we're looking for. So when we examine it from a feminist perspective, we're going to use these concepts, gender, oppression, inequality, and patriarchy, in which to look at the character situation, to understand the situation she's in, to figure out what are the factors that are influencing her behavior. In this same slideshow, you will see questions that a feminist critic might ask about those characters in order to determine, are there any factors that are influencing this character's behavior from a feminist perspective? So they might look at oppression or barriers presented in the work, showing signs of resistance, unique concerns to women around the time and place. And then these are more specific about what the characters are afraid of in this particular story. But we're going to look at roles of women, focus on female characters, examples of patriarchy and oppression based on those feminist concepts. And we can't ignore the symbols that we identified through our first reading. So here's what I thought, is that sometimes you can understand the concept, but looking for them in the story might be a little bit more challenging. So I've created this organizer so that you can maybe put together some ideas and think about which part you would like to focus in for your response. Maybe you want to use all of these examples or all of these concepts in which to piece together not only the meaning of this story, but how feminist theory brings more substance to understanding the reasons for her behavior. So Our end goal is to come up with a thesis statement that answers the following. What meaning comes from the story touching bottom when analyzed from a feminist perspective? And how are the concepts of gender roles, inequality, or even oppression represented in the story? So after you complete this chart, and I'll go through it in just a minute, you're going to take some of these ideas and answer those questions using the thesis builder video that we had. Maybe you don't need that anymore. Maybe you can just take these two, here's your question, here's your concepts, and maybe you can piece that all together. So let's go through these parts that we're going to use to evaluate the story to maybe come up with some concepts that we can use to examine it from a feminist perspective. The first one is gender roles for girls, women, or what is feminine. What symbols or items in this story are used to reinforce the roles of women as subservient? As we know through patriarchy, that's the systemic practice where males typically hold power and decision-making in our society. It would also be important to examine the gender roles of males in this particular story. Are they acting the way that they are acting because that is the assumption of how men should behave? So if I was to look for gender roles of girls, women, or what it means to be feminine, I would find it interesting. Maybe some examples that I would have is the idea of swimming or being powerful or strong, and even looking at the idea of the father wanting her to be the best swimmer by practicing holding her breath, all of those things. Being an athlete, being strong, and knowing that sometimes you have to hold your breath, but that you're always going to get air. Okay, so I could talk about the assumption as to what her position is in the story, what symbols reinforce the roles of women as subservient in each of the situations, whether it be her father, her husband, or even her stepson. We often see that she is not in a power position. With her father, even though it's a loving relationship, he is the one telling her how and when to do things. When she marries her husband, he is the one who is already established. This is not his first marriage. He is wealthy, and he has more power than her in terms of money, but also position and age. Then when we look at Ian, even though Ian is younger, there is a conflict between Ian and his mother and his stepmother as to position and role in Ian's life. Not that the main character has control over her own life as a new wife and as a stepmother to Ian. So these are just some ideas as to what you want to look at as the idea of the main character, who is the only female in the story other than the woman on the beach with the teddy bear bikini and the stepmother, which is interesting because the only time, someone else brought this up, the only time that these female characters interact with one another, there is only conflict. So even though the girl in the teddy bear bikini doesn't realize it, there is conflict with her because she is flirting with, even unknowingly, with another woman's husband. And so that's a conflict with the protagonist. The protagonist has a conflictual relationship with the sister-in-law as well as with the stepmother. So when we look at the gender roles of men, we can see this through Ian, the idea of being manly or independent, that they don't need anyone, that they can be and exist on their own. And it's interesting that Ian needed her in order to survive the current of the ocean. And that he was all about self-preservation, whereas her role was to make sure Ian was okay. She was actually going to sacrifice herself so that Ian was okay. Isn't that interesting? It was only at the last minute when she had nothing left to give that she pushed off the bottom and made her last-ditch effort to live and not drown. So there's an example of just going through the stories and try and pick apart all the different elements that we have here. So who holds power and who doesn't? I've talked about these sometimes are connected. So you might have to say here that these are similar to the examples above, or maybe you have an example that differentiates. How does the character respond to male authority? Let's look at her different relationships. How do we know that she's subservient? I've stated it here, but how do we know that? How does she respond to men having the position of power in this situation, but also over her? In what ways are oppression or barriers presented, and what symbols come to represent barriers or fears for the main character? Here's where we're using those literary devices, but we're going to give it a little bit more meaning by bringing in feminist theory to say they don't just represent fears. Can they represent something more when it comes to feminist theory, right? So we're looking at those 4 concepts that we had right up here. What do those come to represent? What part of this can we give that substance to? And last but not least, what if any point does the female character show resistance to the oppression? So in the very end, we know that she stands up for herself and that she's able to stand on her own, literally coming out of the ocean, that she survived drowning. But also after that moment, she realizes that she can be on her own and chooses to leave her husband and get a divorce. So what do we see before that big movement, before that big moment at the end of the story? Do we see her pushing back against the things that are holding her back? Or is it only a building point to that moment where it's literally do or die, and that is the only moment when she digs deep and is able to find that resistance to push back against everything? So I'm going to post this organizer in the in Google Classroom so that you can use it. If you just want to make a copy, then you can type it up for yourself. Use these ideas that you type up, have discussions with other classmates that we're working with, and see if you can piece all those together to answer these questions and create a thesis statement. And because I'm trying to make things overly complicated, instead of posting every single link and everything that I have referenced in the past couple of tutorial videos, I'll post the 2 videos that I made today about feminism re-explained. I made a video last week about feminism, but I think some things need to be clarified. And you will see the link for this video posted right here. So there will be all of these links that I used in these 2 videos that you can access those instead of cluttering it up in Google Classroom with all of these links that you may or may not use. So they're all going to be in one called Feminist Perspective in Literature, but I will link these 2 videos in particular as some people may want to see those directly, as it is going to help them, hopefully, to create their thesis and to think about touching bottom from a feminist perspective.